All right. So let's see, John Thomas, JT, you've been a software dev for over a decade. Congratulations, that's very cool. With a primary focus on mobile applications, moving into InfoSec. And you said that you've got a long time love of cybercrime films. You mentioned something about being CIA hacker or CIA hacker when you grew up. How do you feel about that now?
Less interested now.
Less interested now. The digital privacy part stepped in.
Yeah.
So digital privacy turns out is good for bad guys and good guys alike, right?
Yes. Yep.
But then again, I guess that brings up the age-old question: who decides if you're a good guy or a bad guy? I know there are people in the world that think that I'm a bad guy. I like to think that I'm a good guy.
Yeah, I think that's really up to your ethics, your morals, where you sit on those kind of things.
So you've been, do you have a favorite cybercrime film that has survived the transition?
You know what? I haven't watched, I can't think of a specific film, but Mr. Robot is, I'm a big fan of Mr. Robot, which is, I think, in that arena for sure.
Definitely in that arena. A little, if you cross cybercrime with a little LSD, you get Mr. Robot. It's quite a show. Very cool. So you've done some consulting for political organizers, journalists, legal observers, and for the public. I'm really interested in those first three. Do you have any that you can throw out just as something of interest?
Well, I'll talk about that in my talk. I prefer not to name specific organizations because actual politics or ideology and is not really I don't feel comfortable talking about in a professional setting.
That makes total sense. So you're going to give us a rundown on threat modeling, something that's really important in so many different aspects of our lives. If you need anything from me, let me know. Otherwise, I will go into the background and just field some questions. Take it away.
Great. Hello, everyone. Do you ever think about safety during a pandemic? If you do, then chances are you've done threat modeling. Welcome to my talk on Threat Modeling 101. My name is John Thomas, though I go by JT. The only people that call me John these days are my parents and my bank teller. So, about who am I? I'm a freelance and contract software developer, primarily in mobile applications. I've worked in healthcare, advertising, and game development. Currently laid off due to the pandemic and looking to transition into information security. I'm also a political activist or community organizer, your choice of term. And my primary skill set that I offer that community is privacy and security training. I also like to agitate cypherpunk as someone who is an activist advocating for the widespread use of strong cryptography and privacy-enhancing technologies as a route to social and political change. So about this talk, it is not a highly technical talk about threat modeling for enterprise network security or your new Facebook competitor app, though the concepts within could apply to those as well. I haven't done enterprise network security, so I can't talk about it. So the agenda for today, we're going to go over a definition of threat modeling. We're going to talk about threat modeling during a pandemic, some questions to ask yourself when you're doing threat modeling terms, which will then lead into 3 example threat models. And then hopefully we have some time for questions at the end. So the definition of threat modeling. Normally you're not supposed to read slides, but to make this very clear, I'm going to read this one. Threat modeling is a process by which potential threats, such as structural vulnerabilities, can be identified, enumerated, and prioritized, all from a hypothetical attacker's point of view. The purpose of threat modeling is to provide defenders with a systematic analysis of the probable attacker's profile, the most likely attack vectors, and the assets most desired by an attacker. Which the too long didn't read version of that is you want to think like the bad guy in order to shore up your security. So threat modeling during a pandemic. What do you think about when you leave the house? Are you wearing a mask? Are you using hand sanitizer, doing your social distancing as the CDC recommends? What do you do when you bring items into your home from outside? Are you sanitizing them, leaving them in the garage for a few days to hopefully let coronavirus die off? Things like that. That's threat modeling. Are you preparing for financial precarity? I saw an article that said that something like 1/3 of millennials have lost their job in the last several weeks. So people are getting worried and need to consider their financial future. And then finally, what are you thinking about when you choose a service for video conferencing? Obviously, there's been a lot online on Twitter and in the news about Zoom and security flaws with Zoom, but you need to threat model that. Are you considering talking about highly confidential information on Zoom? That maybe you shouldn't use it, but if you're chatting with your friends, it's probably fine. That's going to depend on your threat model. So 5 questions to ask yourself. What do I want to protect? Who do I want to protect it from? How bad are the consequences if I fail? And how likely is it that it will need to protect it? And finally, how much trouble am I willing to go through to prevent potential consequences? So ultimately, when you're doing threat modeling, you're trying to find the pain point and you need to make a decision to solve a problem. When you're doing threat modeling, it has to be actionable. If you're just figuring out what your threat model is and then don't have an action plan afterwards, then the process was relatively useless. So you need to make a decision. So some terms. We have assets. This is what you want to protect. Your adversaries are who I want to protect my assets from. Your threats are what are the potential consequences if you fail to protect your assets. Capabilities, that's your adversaries' capabilities, and that's what they have, what tools they have to achieve their aim. Different adversaries are going to have different capabilities, even when going after the same asset. And then risk, this is the likelihood compared to the severity of consequence that a particular threat is going after a particular asset. So we're going to look at some examples, and we'll start with a company. This is mostly considering cyber attack threat modeling, though obviously companies want to threat model for other scenarios as well. So we have the most important asset that any company have is employee safety, health, and well-being. That's absolutely critical. Secrets and API keys, you probably don't want to commit them to Git. We've seen that happen before. So there's obviously different ways to mitigate that by using environment variables and such things. Personally identifiable information. This could be HR records, but it also could be your client information or your customer information. Critical to hold on to that and realize what attackers might be looking to get out of that information. We also have IT infrastructure. That could be physical servers, obviously cloud assets, and data. Intellectual property, this could be your code, documents, knowledge base, and company financials. Adversaries that companies face. Cyber criminals, their motivation is typically financial. They're in it for the money. Hacktivists, anonymous and related groups, their motivation is usually political or social, and they're doing it for change, for recognition, or as we know, for the lulz. Nation states are another adversary companies face. IP theft from competing countries, intelligence gathering in the defense sector, and so the big thing is to, and these people are doing it, as I'll say, for the flag. And then obviously we have insiders, which is typically your biggest adversary. This could be a malicious actor. maybe a disgruntled employer or something, but also it could be an unwitting employee that has fallen for a phishing attack. You know, outside of cyber attacks, you know, Mother Nature could also be an adversary if you're dealing with inclement weather, power outages, and things like that. Threats that company face. Downtime. That's probably one of the biggest because it affects the rest of these as well. Loss of business processes for any amount of time severely affects PR and revenue. Bad PR can cause loss of customers and revenue. Legal cases for violating certain local and state laws. Governance is important. Loss of revenue. You know, a lot of companies can recover from that and you may mitigate that using cybersecurity insurance or things like that. However, that's kind of the biggest threat for any company. Adversary capabilities, or TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Denial of service, you know, the old classic of DDoS. Ransomware. This happened to my dad's former employer. They're not in security at all. They're in industrial space, and they were down for a week. No emails, nothing. No access to their shared drives, and it was a huge hit. Though fortunately, they were able to recover from it. Social engineering can often be the first step for any of these to gain physical access or for a successful phishing attempt. Social media manipulation, using bots or using large amount of bots on social media, Twitter or Facebook, to try to cause bad PR for a company. Next, we're going to look at risk for companies. Risk, like as I said before, is the likelihood versus the severity of consequence. Downtime might be very high. Bad PR, medium risk. Legal cases, medium risk. Loss of revenue, maybe a high risk. So these 1 through 5 for likelihood, maybe rare, unlikely, possible, likely, and almost certain, whereas severity would be insignificant, minor, moderate, major, and severe. Downtime is probably the worst thing that can happen because it leads to the bad PR and loss of revenue. Ultimately, when you're doing threat modeling, you're trying to make decisions on how to make them to make threats less likely and less severe. So activist threat modeling, this is very different than probably a lot of people are used to. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about activist threat modeling in some of the training and groups that I work with. So activists have a very different look at assets. Their communications are absolutely critical, all digital communication. It's very popular to use Signal for activists and other end-to-end encrypted services. Identity. A lot of groups I work with use alias names as a mitigation to avoid doxing by political opponents, but also to avoid, there's been cases where within an activist group, even if everyone is typically on the same political axis, find some kind of internal drama and someone may feel the need to harm someone else, and hiding your identity is a good way to mitigate that. Meeting locations. This is probably one of the hardest assets to protect just because everyone's always carrying phones with them. And as we know, phones track your location at all times. In the era of pandemics, organizing has moved to video conferencing, such as Zoom. And one group that I work with came to me asking about Zoom security because they were holding a semi-public meeting where viewers were not super vetted and people came and put pornography and swastikas on the screen share, kind of ruined the meeting. So they were asking me for tactics for securing those meetings. Adversaries. Law enforcement is probably activists' biggest adversary. Even when the groups that I work with are all above board, they're all operating legally, but not all activists do. And so law enforcement is doing its own threat modeling And unfortunately, that means that all activists kind of get roped into the same net while law enforcement figures out who's doing things legally and who isn't. And we know historically that law enforcement targets, during the civil rights movement and even in modern times. Political opponents, they want to find dirt or cause various types of harm, such as causing job loss and things like that. Nation states, mass surveillance is probably the biggest thing that they have to find things out about activists, depending on what country you're in. Obviously, this has different levels of danger, depending on what kind of activism you're doing and the various rights or lack of rights that you have. And then final, infiltrators. This could be law enforcement or political opponents, but also compromised organizers. For instance, if an organizer gets arrested and wants to take a plea deal, that plea deal might include divulging information about people that they work with. Also, there's grand jury subpoenas, which you basically have to answer whatever questions the DA wants. Otherwise, you're in contempt of court and face jail time because of that. So, threats that activists face. Job loss. If you end up talking about something that your employer, your boss doesn't like, you may face job loss. Doxing. This can be online or in-person harassment, threats to family, swatting, and where an opponent may make a fake call to law enforcement to send a SWAT team to your house. Jail time, arrest and jail time is obviously a big one. That's that's a threat that anytime at a political action, some kind of rally, if things get heated and someone decides to start something like a street fight or a riot breaks out, then there is the risk of arrest. Great bodily harm or death. That is unfortunately something typically less concerning in the United States, but obviously a big concern in other countries with more authoritarian regimes and less rights. So let's look at adversary capabilities for activists. We have location data and non-encrypted comms that mass surveillance will pick up. We have targeted surveillance, which could include physical surveillance or wiretapping. Open source intelligence or OSINT. This is using public social media, data breaches, and things like that to find out information. Even if you think your Twitter alias is secret, maybe use the same tag somewhere else and someone's able to dig well enough in to find out who you actually are. And then we have infiltration, political opponents and law enforcement. These are unfortunately some of the problems as well as that the activists face and capability they need to watch out for. Finally, let's look at risk rating for activists. Again, likelihood is rare, unlikely, possible, likely, or almost certain. Severity is insignificant, minor, moderate, major, or severe. You can see the risk rating that I put here, but obviously this is going to depend on context, personal actions, what country you're in, constitutional rights or lack thereof. If you're doing something that's illegal, then arrest is going to be a higher risk. If you're not, then arrest is a lower risk. So this is sort of a general risk rating that I've put based on the groups that I work with. One more example. This one looks a little bit different because I found a graphic, but it's Batman's threat model. Found this graphic on Ars Technica. We have his assets, which are the Batcave, Alfred, who could become kidnapped or threatened, his emails and his texts. You notice here in his threat model, they've added protection, which would be like mitigation and validation of protection, which the EFF's threat model terms does not cover. So whether or not you consider mitigation to be part of threat modeling or not, the EFF does not. That would come next after the threat model, but this model does show protection such as his security systems, hiding his location, encryption. His threats which we're calling adversaries in this talk, be police, who obviously Batman has a mixed relationship with, the Joker, who's Batman's enemy of choice, and journalists who are always trying to find out who Batman really is. And that's my talk. If you'd like to connect with me, my email is jt@radicalwhisper.com. I'm also on Twitter @radicalwhisper. If you'd like to ask more questions or talk a copy of the slide deck, I'm happy to share it. I'd also want to thank Clay Moody. He was my coach for this talk. He's been a tremendous help and allowed me to practice with him several times and gave me a lot of pointers. Thank you to the EFF for their security education companion, which is probably my biggest resource when doing security and privacy trainings, and for a big resource for this talk as well. Finally, I'd like to thank GRIM for putting this conference on and for giving me the opportunity to talk at my first conference.
Thank you,
and now there might be time for some questions.
Yeah, thank you, JT. That was a nice presentation. Not just an intro to threat modeling, but the application of the process. I love your, can you back up to your slide with the 5 questions?
Sure. Let's go all the way back here.
Most of the time that I've done threat modeling, the majority of the threat modeling that I've done, it was before it was called threat modeling. I had to try to make it up with a whole bunch of other people in the industry. The 5 question slide, what do I want to protect? Who do I want to protect it from? How bad are the consequences if I fail? How likely is it that I would need to protect it? And how much trouble am I willing to go through to avoid the consequences? So just about every time that I've sat through a meeting with the people who have to make the decisions. Now remember, we don't get to make the decisions. We have to guide people through them. These questions have been the one. I've been through meetings where it's been successful, and I've been through meetings where it's been failing. The ones that were successful, these 5 questions were the key. So thank you for sharing them in such a easily digestible form. Especially Batman's threat model. One of my favorite thing about a presentation is wrapping in humor to make it more meaningful, and that about knocked me out of my chair. Thank you.
Yeah, you know what? When I do this a version of this presentation to groups, we typically actually break off into side groups and do threat modeling as a process for Batman. Someone takes the Joker, someone takes law enforcement, someone takes Batman. And we break off into groups. So unfortunately, we can't do a hands-on activity in this format.
Nice. So just a few comments and let's see, a couple questions. First one from Mr. Widget, fantastic prezo JT. Very nicely done, I agree. Let's see, there's a question to be handled offline. So here's a question from Saija. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. How do you make the teams and customer to update the model? I find it hard for them to actually ever update it. It's a great question. Do you have anything to say?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure, sorry if there's some noise. The question is, how do you make the teams and customer to update the model? So periodically ask the questions again. I find it hard for them to actually ever update it.
Oh, well, so I haven't had a lot of experience threat modeling in a professional sense, but when I'm working with groups, what I try to do is, as new groups, new members are coming in, I try to do a threat modeling or reach out, or they reach out to me to do a training, every 6 months or every year or so. And in doing so, we can talk about, we have more one-on-one discussions on what has changed, what they're doing, and how their assets have changed, and how these different terms have changed over time, so that we can redo the threat modeling. So I typically try to reach out myself and say, hey, let's do this again, because I want to make sure that everyone's private and secure.
Very good guidance. It sounds like it's gonna be situation specific? Because it sounds like, I mean, you're coming in as a consultant oftentimes, right? So when you come in, somebody's kind of got the idea internally that it's time to renew or start fresh. So probably each organization has to come up with how to get around, well, actually, how to get things done in any organization is a skill that is unique to that organization oftentimes. So it's a great question. Leandro says, can I have a copy of the presentation?
Yeah, I can either post it, maybe I can post it on GitHub, or just shoot me an email and I'll respond with a copy of it.
Great. Or reach out on Discord. Did you say that that you're on Discord answering questions as well?
Yep, I'm happy to hop into Discord, or I'm already in Discord, and answer any further questions or share the file if that's allowed.
All right, let's see. Oh, here's a great one from Marauda. Ruda, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it very well. What teams should be involved in doing threat modeling? Is it only the IS team? Who else?
I think threat modeling should include many teams. So for instance, legal. The big thing that I found, I'm in grad school right now for information security, and the big thing that comes up time and time again is leadership buy-in. So if you don't have leadership buy-in, even from the non-technical, from the business side, then information security is going to fall flat. So you have to have leadership buy-in, and so that's probably the most important team is your executive team, but including information security, if you have facilities or physical security, and then training for all employees on threat modeling in a non-technical, digestible way is critical.
Let's see, Miguel asks, would you compare these 5 questions with the risk calculation and management?
I'm not sure I understand what he's asking.
I'm not sure that I totally understand it either. Sorry, Miguel, can you shoot again with a little more clarification? Sean asks, can you speak at all to the idea of separating capabilities from intentions?
Ooh. Yeah, so just because someone has a capability to do something doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to use that capability. And what someone is trying to do, what their intention is, sometimes they'll have access to capabilities to help with that intent, and sometimes they won't. I don't feel like that's a great answer, but that's my answer.
All right, any other questions?
And I'm happy to think about this further and respond more in depth on Discord.
Yeah, it's a nice thing about having you around for the rest of the day. Thank you so much, JT. Appreciate your great presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I let him off the hook here? All right, I think you're free.
Alrighty, I'll be in Discord. I got my legal name in there, so just at me, or I'll be in there the rest of the day. Thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the con.
Sounds great. Thanks, sir.